The global political sphere following World War II was one of rapid change. Western European powers began to fade into the background of this political landscape, while more polar powers like the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics came to the forefront. In focusing on the USSR and its aftermath, significant governmental and ideological shifts became glaringly apparent. Mikhail Gorbachev, in his leadership role as the last president of the Union, was responsible for a large part of these seminal changes, firmly establishing his legacy in history. Russia's primary form of governance for centuries had been Tsardom, but this was dismantled in 1917 as a result of the Russian Revolution. With Vladimir Lenin at the helm, the Russian Soviet Federate Socialist Republic was founded. After World War II, Russia expanded to become the Soviet Union on December 29, 1922. In its course, the Soviet Union has seen many significant leaders who served as the precursors to Gorbachev's reforms. From its origin, the Soviet Union functioned as a dominant party system, with the Communist Party in power. Lenin became premier first and introduced his new economic policy, coined state capitalism. This plan aimed to stimulate the Soviet economy after the gruesome Civil War. After Lenin, Joseph Stalin came into power and ruled with an iron fist. He replaced Lenin's capitalism with a centralized command economy that transformed the formerly agrarian Soviet Union into an industrialized power, leading the USSR through its reconstruction phase. Stalin consolidated his power during the Cold War and became a tyrant. Paradoxically, his death was mourned heavily. Nikita Khrushchev arose as the chief executive upon Stalin's death, initiating an era of de-Stalinization. Leonid Brezhnev replaced Khrushchev and led the economy towards stagnation. He was succeeded by Yuri Andropov. Finally, Gorbachev's predecessor, Konstantin Chernenko, took office, but his legacy was relatively weak. In fact, on the day that he died, Soviet newspapers reported his death and Gorbachev's selection on the same page. Gorbachev's political career began in 1963 when he became the head of the Department of Party Organs in Stavropol Agricultural Kraikom. He later became a member of the Communist Party in 1971 and worked his way up through the ranks to General Secretary. Gorbachev's primary goal as General Secretary was to revive the Soviet economy after the Brezhnev years. As a result, the idea of Госприемка, which is the state approval of production, was introduced. This concept of regulation was enacted in an effort to control the quality of manufactured goods, as well as to prevent corruption within manufacturing companies. Gorbachev also shifted the political structure by cleaning out the ineffective committee members within the Communist Party. Gorbachev promoted freedom and democracy in Russia through his policies, two of the most famous being Perestroika and Glasnost.
Here we have a deeply developed strategy, a program of perestroika that has been thought through and suffered.
Perestroika, which means reconstructing, encompassed Gorbachev's political reforms. These market-like reforms aimed to enhance socialism, not dismantle the command economy. Perhaps the most significant of the reforms was that of demokratizatsiya, or democratization. This introduced multi-candidate elections to the Soviet Union, which became the first step in undermining the power of the CPSU. According to Gorbachev, these elections also signaled a new phase.
It wasn't full-blown democracy, but it was the beginning of the end of the communist system.
Why did I do it? Because I felt that there was a real possibility that the Communist Party elite might one day oust me and strip me of any power, and that would be the end of any reform in the country.
Additionally, Gorbachev instituted the Congress of People's Deputy, which served as a new legislative body, yet the power of the communists was preserved, as 1/3 of the seats in the Congress were preserved for party members. Economic reforms also occurred under Perestroika. In 1985, Gorbachev openly admitted to the blatant economic shortcomings that persisted in the USSR. Following this speech, the law on state enterprises was passed, allowing output levels to be determined by demand. Foreign investment through joint ventures was also instilled, connecting Russia with international business partners. Yet the perestroika was severely flawed. While on the surface its free market capitalist policies appeared positive, they simply took too long to implement.
My mistake, the mistake of my associates and of myself, was that we moved too slowly on the reform of the Union.
As a result, people found themselves stuck in a worn-out economy, which led to civil unrest and a decentralized economic mechanism. Contrastingly, glasnost was more of a social policy that gave freedoms such as speech, press, and private business ownership to the Soviet people. However, this openness had a reverse effect regarding the power of the Soviet state. As the affairs of the government became more accessible, any flaws or aspects of corruption became public domain, which caused civil unrest, particularly in the satellite states of the Union. Attempts to define the sphere of influence of the Union to include the Baltic states exacerbated tensions even greater, and by 1989, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as well as Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, had all declared sovereignty. Gorbachev also altered foreign policy to improve relations with the West and mitigate lasting Cold War tensions. The most significant example of these improved relations came in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, but there are many other factors that came into play. One such was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, in which Gorbachev heeded to Western demands.
Today, I, for the United States, and the General Secretary for the Soviet Union, have signed the first agreement ever to eliminate an entire class of U.S. and Soviet nuclear weapons. We have made history.
This new anti-nuclear policy may have been catalyzed by the events of Chernobyl. On April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, causing deadly exposure to nuclear radiation in the nearby town of Pripyat, Ukraine. However, Soviet citizens were only informed 2 days after the explosion occurred, highlighting the lapses in governmental transparency. Gorbachev used the explosion to prove the necessity of glasnost. According to him, the Chernobyl explosion was a turning point that opened the possibility of much greater freedom of expression, to the point that the system as we knew it could no longer continue. He perceived the devastating Chernobyl explosion to perhaps be the real cause of the Soviet Union collapse. By 1990, it was clear that the Soviet Union was in crisis, and the CPSU gradually began to spiral out of control. Although Gorbachev tried to combat the ominous situation by instituting various reforms following his election to presidency on March 15th, the dark forces of nationalism still hovered eerily. Furthermore, Gorbachev's attempts to assign himself more power through the instatement of the Presidential Council made him increasingly unpopular. In the wake of August 1991, a coup headed by the State Committee of the State of Emergency attempted to strip Gorbachev of his power. Gorbachev soon found that neither the Union nor Russian power structures heeded his commands, forcing him to fire large numbers of his Politburo and charge members of the Gang of Eight with treason for attempting to overthrow him. Gorbachev still faced heavy opposition, however. After the dissemination of the Congress of People's Deputies, Boris Yeltsin gained significant ground in his vie for power, culminating Gorbachev's collapse and resignation. Ironically, policies that gained Gorbachev international recognition also gained him domestic notoriety. Though in hindsight, Gorbachev's policies seemed ineffective and untenable, their place in Russian history is significant. Gorbachev's influence is ideological. He introduced Soviet Russia to the ideas of the rest of the world, breaking down barriers both literal and metaphorical. Although these reforms did not revolutionize Russia in the way that Gorbachev intended, they helped bring the Soviet Union into the modern and globalized world, solidifying Gorbachev's lasting legacy.